Welcome back. Well, we are discussing the evolving situation as far as Iran-US conflict is concerned, and of course, the potential of yet another round of talks in Islamabad. And now, from Washington, we are joined by a well-known analyst, Mr. Michael Kugelman. He is a senior fellow, South Asia, at Atlantic Council, and also writes regularly at foreign policy, particularly issues related to South Asia. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Inside Foreign Affairs. And let me ask first, yesterday, I think 24 hours ago, when the Iranian foreign minister on X announced that they are reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and following that, we saw President Trump, one after the other, making statements on his Truth Social. It appeared that probably both Iran and the US were on the verge of some kind of a deal, but 24 hours later, it appears that things remain uncertain, as the Iranian side are now saying that they haven't yet decided to really negotiate with the US, given how Trump is reacting. So how in Washington you are reading this entire situation?
Well, I think that on the one hand, it is disappointing that it appears that there's a significant disagreement over the issue of the Strait of Hormuz, and I say that's concerning because this is actually, in my view, or should be one of the more easier issues to address. I think when it comes to the issue of Iran's nuclear program, or to the idea of trying to get a permanent peace, those are much more ambitious and challenging outcomes to aspire to. But when it comes to getting an agreement on the Strait, it really shouldn't be that hard, given what we've seen from these two sides before. Clearly, the hope is to reopen it while getting Iran the economic and security assurances it would need to ensure it would be comfortable opening it up again. But the fact that Iran has said that it's now closed, I mean, that's very concerning. But I do think that we need to keep things in perspective. I think much of this public messaging from both sides should be regarded as posturing. We've seen this throughout the last few weeks while the negotiations have taken place, and even in the hours leading up to the first round of talks in Islamabad last weekend, there had been some pretty heated rhetoric on both sides, particularly from the U.S. side. So I'm cautiously optimistic that despite the public rhetoric and the messaging and what we've seen play out recently, that in due course the two sides will at least be in a better position to feel comfortable discussing some type of arrangement on the Strait.
Okay, but do you think that this is, the Iranian reaction yesterday, the Iranian foreign minister's statement regarding the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and then if you closely watch the Iranian state media, there was some backlash. Some of their leaders were saying that this statement was not correct. Rather, it was not transparent. He did not provide the Iranian foreign minister full details. So do you think that, the way Iran is dealing this entire issue, it is just posturing, or it also has to do the internal power dynamics, maybe hardliners versus those who want to have deal with the Iranians, with the US, sorry?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on here, I'm sure. I mean, one thing is that, we know that Iran's leadership has been struck in a big way. I mean, because of what happened in the war, you had significant changes in leadership, and my sense is that the decision-making process in Iran in terms of, how particular issues, how those leaders that are in power go about figuring out what they want to do and conveying that to the top, it perhaps has become a bit more complicated given all these sudden leadership changes. So maybe that might explain to a degree what appears to be inconsistent messaging and so on and so forth. I do think that the public, trying to ensure that whatever is done in a way that doesn't upset the public is part of the issue as well. But, at the end of the day, my sense is that Iran and the United States want to get some type of an arrangement done on the Strait. I mean, I would say that the most immediate priority that both sides would have is getting an extension on the truce, which, of course, is scheduled to expire in a few days. But I do think that there is a strong incentive on both sides to get an agreement on the Strait. So again, I'm cautiously optimistic that we will see some changes. But final point I'll make on this: it is notable that in the days after the Trump administration announced the naval blockade the Iranians were pretty quiet. They didn't really respond, at least not publicly, to that, which suggested that maybe they thought it was best to keep quiet in the hopes that there'd be some type of a good chance of a deal coming out. But the fact that Iran has now responded, of course, initially they said they'd open it. Now they're saying that they're not. Maybe that suggests a level of skepticism in Tehran creeping in about the prospects of getting some type of deal anytime soon. I hope that's not true, because if that's the case, that would suggest that we could be in there may not be a second round of talks as soon as we thought there might be, which could have been in the coming days.
As you mentioned regarding, of course, that both Iran and the U.S. Really want to move on from this, because there is no incentive either for the U.S. or for, as a matter of fact, for Iran to go back to hostilities. So while there is a lot of uncertainty, as you said, that the temporary ceasefire is going to end very soon. So do you think that this ceasefire, the temporary ceasefire, will be extended irrespective when those talks in Islamabad takes place, given that both sides do not have the appetite to immediately go back to war?
Well, I mean, I think at this point, the question is, could there be a decision on the part of both sides to agree to an extension of the ceasefire in the absence of formal talks? Or is this something that has to be achieved as an outcome of direct face-to-face talks? Given that time is running out, right? The truce is scheduled to expire, I believe, on April 22nd, which is just a few days. That, I think, given logistics and travel issues and various other factors, makes it unlikely that you'd be able to have the two sides get together to talk face-to-face on very senior levels in time to negotiate an extension of that truce. I'd like to hope that somehow they would agree to extend it without the formal talks, but a lot of it depends on how each side takes action over the next few days. I mean, will the U.S. be willing to relent on this naval blockade? It doesn't seem so. At least that's not what the public messaging suggests, and that suggests that the Iranians may not be willing to relent on the issue of of taking control of the Strait again. Would they be able to agree to extend the truce if there's not an agreement on the Strait? There should be, but again, I don't know. But I will say this: that to me, the easiest outcome here, and here is where I think Pakistan, as a lead mediator, can be helpful. Even if it's just a matter of working the phones with both capitals. Of course, the field marshal was just in Iran. The prime minister has been on this trip to a series of key countries involved in the facilitation efforts. I think that this is something you just have to get both sides to agree to extend the truce, because that'll just buy more time to focus on these other issues, including the issue of the Strait, which clearly has become a bit more difficult of an issue than expected to negotiate some type of arrangement for.
Do you think that President Trump speaking too much or prematurely is also a problem, because there were indications that there might be some kind of understanding already reached between the two sides through back channels facilitated by Pakistan regarding the nuclear issue, particularly the enriched uranium. And President Trump also made that statement that Iran was ready to give up that enriched uranium. He called it a dust. But then the Iranian reacted, no, that we have not yet decided. So do you think that here President Trump is a problem when he speaks too much?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's absolutely a method to the president's madness. I mean, I think that there is, this is not just him ranting on social media. I think that there is something calculated about this. He's an expert negotiator from his previous life in the business world. But at the same time, I mean, this is a president who is widely viewed as extremely unconventional, to put it mildly. And I think that given that, it is important that both sides not place too much stock, or not, I shouldn't say both sides. The Iranian side should not place too much stock in what the president is saying publicly. And I think this goes for all of the facilitators and Pakistan as a mediator. Let's remember that when President Trump addressed the nation in the U.S. several weeks ago, he said all types of terrible things about Iran. He called it a cancer, all types of awful things. And negotiations were taking place even against that backdrop. And not long after that, we had the round of talks in Islamabad. So I would like to think that the two sides will continue to make calculations about negotiations, not based on what the president is saying publicly, but what's happening behind the scenes, and of course based on actions on the ground.
How do you see Pakistan's role as a mediator? Initially, when Pakistan's name was mentioned, there was a lot of skepticism that whether Pakistan, had the capacity or even a cloud to influence, this war. But apparently, it seems that Pakistan is not just acting as a mediator, but playing a far more significant role that earlier many people believed.
Yeah, no, Pakistan has really defied a lot of naysayers who first thought that Pakistan would not really be effective even as a go-between. It was able to do that very well. Then there was skepticism that it wouldn't be able to step forward to play the role of a mediator. And of course, it did that very effectively, I would argue, in Islamabad last weekend, even though there was not a deal. And I think what's most important is that Pakistan has clearly earned the trust of both the Americans and the Iranians. And I think that's especially significant coming from, well, really in both cases, given that Pakistan's ties with Iran and the U.S. were not that good even a few years ago. But obviously things have changed in a hurry. In terms of what's happening now, well, here's a case where public messaging from the president really matters, and that is where the president has repeatedly praised Pakistan. Not only the president, but his top deputies. The White House press secretary the other day very significantly said that the president sees Pakistan as the sole mediator. That is a critical point right there. So that suggests that moving forward, however these things play out, Pakistan will be at the front, and assuming that there is a second round of talks, we can assume that Pakistan will host them. If it doesn't host them, it'll presumably have a seat at the table, a prominent seat at the table, whether the next round of talks are in Switzerland or Turkey or whatever the case. I suspect they would be in Pakistan when they happen. But I think that it's important that even Pakistan's biggest critics acknowledge that this is a country that's been able to leverage its diplomatic alignments in a big way, in the sense that it has good ties with all the key countries at play here, the Iranians and the Americans and the other facilitators. That's really significant, and I don't think any other country has that status to claim. So absolutely, Pakistan is not going to rest on its laurels. It's not going to fade back and let other countries move forward to take on the role of mediator. Pakistan's going to continue to do it, and especially when the U.S. side is publicly amplifying the role that Pakistan will and can and must play in this effort.
Well, there has been a lot of focus, of course, the claims and counterclaims and the rhetoric from both sides, but Pakistani army chief in this entire, of course, chaos, spent 3 days in Tehran meeting the political and the military leadership. Do you think this was surprising for you? One, Pakistani army chief's decision traveling to, of course, Tehran, and then staying there for 3 days.
Well, I mean, this is another indication of just how involved Pakistan is in this peace process. Not just involved, but driving it and leading it. And my understanding is that, much of his visit there has focused on some of the more ambitious components of this situation, including in Iran's nuclear program. I think that's a good sign. And we know that the field marshal has a significant amount of experience focused on Iran. As you'll remember, he had been in Iran right before he met with President Trump at the White House for the first time last June. It's another reason, I think, one of the many reasons why President Trump values Munir. So I think this is very significant. And if you couple the fact that Munir spent 3 days in Iran with the fact that Prime Minister Sharif, has been on this trip to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar. I know not in that order, but visiting those countries. That's basically you're checking off all the boxes, so to speak, right? You've got one top leader engaging with the Iranians, the other talking to key facilitators, and that combined with the engagements that I'm sure the Pakistanis are having with the Americans, I'm sure they're keeping them well informed about all this. That's certainly a good thing. Now, given that we're hearing that there's still concerns and disagreements, and the two sides are not seeing eye to eye on many things, not a surprise. It's going to take a long time. But I do think that, for me, the biggest takeaway of the field marshal's 3-day visit to Iran is just how much Pakistan is leading from the front on this effort, and it is not shying away from what is clearly a very challenging task.
Well, President Trump already indicated that if there is an agreement with Tehran, so he would probably travel to Islamabad to sign that deal. So many people in Pakistan obviously curious and asking questions. Yes, that Pakistan is being praised for playing this role, but people are asking questions that what dividends Pakistan can actually get if ultimately is able to broker a deal between Iran and the United States. So you know the US system better. Pakistan and the US always have transactional relationship. What kind of benefits Pakistan really can get out of this deal if really at the end of the day is successful?
Yeah, it's an important point. I mean, I think it is important to keep the simplest consideration in mind, and that is that, Pakistan, I think, would want to see a deal happen mainly because it is so vulnerable to the effects of this conflict, right? It's probably more vulnerable than any country outside the Middle East for reasons that you well know. So I think that, we should be thinking about how Pakistan can leverage a deal, and I could talk about that. But, getting a deal is something that would be incredibly important for Pakistan just because it really wants the war to end because it's so affected by it. But in terms of how it might look to get something in return from the Trump administration, absolutely. One thing that comes to mind, as you know, most American security aid to Pakistan has been suspended since Trump himself, early in his first term, ordered that much of it be suspended. And we've seen some openings over the last few months and really over the last year plus as the U.S.-Pakistan relationship has gotten back on track. There's been some indications of growing security cooperation, but I think that there'd be a strong desire and maybe even an expectation on Pakistan's part that this would be something that would prompt the Trump administration to take a look at that suspension on security aid to put Pakistan in a better place to tackle its significant security challenges, particularly the resurgence of terrorism. The conflict with the Taliban for now seems to have calmed, but that's still going to be a concern for Pakistan. So I think that's one area, and we have seen the U.S., what little it's said about Pakistan's conflict with the Taliban. The U.S. has firmly come on Pakistan's side, saying that it respects Pakistan's right to self-defense and so on and so forth. So that's one thing to look at. The only other thing I'd say here would relate less to the U.S. and to some of Pakistan's other key allies. I suspect that if Pakistan were to get a deal, it might well try to leverage that in its dealings with its donors, its Gulf donors. I think Pakistan could perhaps, come to them and say, well, look, we helped end a war that hit you hard. Let's talk about refinancing loans, renegotiating loans. And I think that's an especially significant issue in light of what happened with the UAE, where, of course, Pakistan ended up repaying its loan to the UAE because, in part, as my understanding is, the interest rate that it was being charged was too high and it wasn't able to negotiate a lower one. So it's important to keep a broader context in mind when thinking about how Pakistan might try to leverage a potential deal with Iran.
Michael Kugelman, many thanks indeed for joining us and giving your insights regarding the evolving situation as far as Iran-US tensions are concerned. That's it from this week from the Inside Foreign Affairs. Do join us next week. Good night.